Charlotte's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing through the grand foyer of the Ashcroft estate. The morning sun streamed through stained glass, painting fractured rainbows across the polished banister, but the air was brittle, charged with a tension that made the staff freeze mid. At the center of it all stood Miss Ruth, her hands folded, her back straight, her eyes steady and unreadable. She wore her uniform with quiet dignity, the same way she had for nearly 3 decades, but today, her presence seemed to fill the room with something heavier than memory. Charlotte's voice, usually soft and measured, cut through the silence like a blade. "You're dismissed, Miss Ruth, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, shocking in their finality. A gasp escaped from one of the maids, quickly stifled. The butler, Mr. Hargrove, looked away, his jaw clenched. No one moved to intervene. Miss Ruth's gaze never wavered. She met Charlotte's eyes, searching for the little girl she once soothed through nightmares and heartbreaks. But Charlotte's face was a mask impenetrable, cold, and resolute. "I trusted you," Charlotte continued, her voice trembling just enough to betray the storm beneath. "But I can't ignore what's happened. You know why this is necessary." A flicker of pain crossed Miss Ruth's face, gone as quickly as it came. She nodded once, her dignity unbroken. "I understand, Miss Charlotte. Sometimes, the truth is heavier than we expect." Her words, calm and enigmatic, seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. The staff exchanged glances, their eyes darting between the two women. They all knew the stories how Miss Ruth had been more of a mother to Charlotte than anyone else, how she'd held the family together through scandal and sorrow. Yet now, she was being cast out, her loyalty repaid with suspicion. As Miss Ruth gathered her few belongings, Charlotte turned away, her shoulders rigid. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft click of the front door as it closed behind Miss Ruth. The staff stood motionless, the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on them all. What could possibly have driven Charlotte to this? And what secret could a nanny possibly hold over an heiress? Charlotte's earliest memories were not of her mother's perfume or her father's laughter, but of Miss Ruth's gentle hands braiding her hair in the quiet hours before dawn. The nursery, with its gilded wallpaper and shelves of porcelain dolls, was a world apart from the rest of the Ashcroft estate, a sanctuary carved out by Miss Ruth's warmth. When Charlotte's mother died suddenly, the house filled with mourners and the scent of lilies. But it was Miss Ruth who held her through the night, whispering stories of hope and resilience. The Ashcroft estate was a monument to old money, sprawling gardens, marble staircases, and oil portraits of ancestors who stared down with cold, assessing eyes. Charlotte's father, Henry Ashcroft, was a man of few words and fewer affections. He spent his days behind the heavy doors of his study, managing the family's investments and entertaining powerful friends. To him, Charlotte was an obligation, a fragile link in the family chain. It was Miss Ruth who attended school recitals, who bandaged scraped knees, who taught Charlotte to read and to question. Yet even in the safety of the nursery, the world's divisions seeped in. Charlotte noticed how the other staff deferred to Miss Ruth, but never quite included her. At dinner parties, Miss Ruth was invisible, her presence acknowledged only when service was required. Charlotte once asked why Miss Ruth never sat at the table with them. Miss Ruth smiled, a sadness flickering in her eyes. "Some seats aren't meant for everyone, child, but that doesn't mean we don't belong." As Charlotte grew, so did her awareness of the unspoken rules that governed her world. She saw how her father's friends spoke to Miss Ruth, polite but distant, their words laced with condescension. She heard whispers about the help and knowing one's place. At school, Charlotte's classmates parroted their parents' prejudices, and she learned to hide her affection for Miss Ruth. Fearing ridicule, despite the barriers, their bond deepened. Miss Ruth taught Charlotte about justice and kindness, about the history that wasn't in her textbooks. She told stories of her own family of ancestors who had once owned land nearby, of dreams deferred but never forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, Charlotte would find Miss Ruth gazing out the window, her expression distant, as if searching for something lost. The estate itself, for all its grandeur, was beginning to show signs of decay. The gardens grew wild at the edges, the roof leaked in the west wing, and the staff whispered about unpaid bills. Charlotte overheard arguments between her father and the family lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, about investments gone wrong and debts mounting. The Ashcroft name still commanded respect, but the foundation was crumbling. One afternoon, Charlotte stumbled upon Miss Ruth in the attic, sorting through old trunks. Among the moth-eaten dresses and faded photographs, Miss Ruth found a small, locked box. She ran her fingers over the intricate carvings, her face unreadable. When Charlotte asked about it, Miss Ruth simply said, "Some things are best left for the right moment." The box disappeared into Miss Ruth's room, and Charlotte never saw it again. As Charlotte entered her teenage years, the distance between her and her father grew. He sent her to boarding school, insisting it was for her own good. Miss Ruth wrote letters every week, filled with encouragement and gentle reminders to stay true to herself. When Charlotte returned home for holidays, she found the estate quieter, the staff reduced, her father more withdrawn. Only Miss Ruth remained unchanged, a steady presence in a world that seemed to be slipping away. There were moments when Charlotte sensed that Miss Ruth carried burdens she could not share. Once, during a thunderstorm, Charlotte found her in the library, clutching an old photograph. Miss Ruth quickly tucked it away, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We all have stories, Miss Charlotte," she said softly. "Some are just waiting for the right time to be told." The years passed, and Charlotte inherited more than just the Ashcroft name as she inherited its secrets, its debts, and its silent wounds. Through it all, Miss Ruth remained her anchor, her confidant, and her conscience. But as the estate's troubles deepened and the world outside grew more uncertain, Charlotte began to wonder just how much Miss Ruth knew about the family's past and what truths might one day come to light. In the shadows of the grand estate, beneath the weight of history and expectation, a question lingered. What did Miss Ruth know about the Ashcroft legacy that no one else dared to speak? The morning the Ashcroft sapphire vanished, the estate was already humming with tension. The sapphire, a brooch set in platinum and ringed with diamonds, had been passed down through generations, a symbol of the family's enduring legacy. It was last seen in the velvet-lined case in Charlotte's dressing room, displayed for the benefit of her guests at the previous night's charity gala. Now, the case lay open and empty, the absence of the brooch more conspicuous than its presence had ever been. Charlotte's heart pounded as she retraced her steps, her mind racing through possibilities. The staff was summoned, lined up in the drawing room, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Miss Ruth stood at the end, her posture calm, her eyes steady. Charlotte's friends, still lingering from the party, whispered in corners, their voices sharp with speculation. "It's always the ones you trust most," murmured one guest, her words slicing through the room. Another nodded, glancing pointedly at Miss Ruth. The implication hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Charlotte's father, pale and agitated, demanded answers. "This is a family heirloom. Ruth, you've always been responsible for Charlotte's things. How could this happen under your watch?" His tone was harsher than Charlotte had ever heard. The accusation clear. Miss Ruth met his gaze without flinching. "I checked the case myself before the guests arrived, sir. It was there. I can't say what happened after." Charlotte felt the eyes of her friends and the staff on her, waiting for her to act. She remembered the stories her father had told her about loyalty and reputation, about how quickly a family's name could be tarnished. The pressure was suffocating. She wanted to believe Miss Ruth, but the voices around her grew louder, feeding her doubts. "Charlotte, you can't let this go unaddressed," insisted her friend Olivia, her tone urgent. "If you don't act, people will talk. They'll say you're weak." Charlotte's hands trembled as she turned to Miss Ruth. "I'm sorry, but I have to think of the family. Until we find out what happened, you're suspended. Please leave the estate." A hush fell over the room. Miss Ruth's face was unreadable, but her eyes glistened with something like sorrow. She gathered her things in silence, her dignity unbroken. As she reached the door, she paused, turning back to Charlotte. "Be careful what you think you know." "Miss Charlotte," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone pause. "Sometimes, the truth is not what it seems." With that, she stepped out, leaving a silence that felt colder than the marble floors. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, and Charlotte felt a pang of regret twist in her chest. Had she done the right thing, or had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? As the door closed behind Miss Ruth, Charlotte was left with more questions than answers. The brooch was still missing, but now, so was the woman who had been her protector, her confidant, and perhaps the only person who truly knew the secrets of the Ashcroft family. The days after Miss Ruth's departure stretched into weeks, each one heavier than the last. The Ashcroft estate, once a place of bustling activity and elegant gatherings, grew eerily quiet. The staff moved through the halls with downcast eyes, their numbers dwindling as Charlotte was forced to let more of them go. The grand rooms echoed with emptiness, and the laughter that once filled the house seemed like a memory from another life. Charlotte tried to maintain a sense of order, but the world she'd always known was slipping through her fingers. The family business, Ashcroft Holdings, was in freefall. Reports of bad investments and mounting debts arrived daily, each one more dire than the last. Her father, once the unshakable pillar of the family, grew frail and withdrawn. He spent his days in the study, staring at old ledgers, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of the numbers. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about stress and heart trouble, but Charlotte knew it was more than that. The loss of the sapphire, the scandal, and the slow collapse of everything he'd built had broken something inside him. Friends, who had once flocked to her side for parties and charity events, now kept their distance. Invitations dried up, and when she did see them, their conversations were clipped and awkward. Olivia, her closest confidant, stopped returning her calls altogether. The whispers that had started with the missing brooch had grown into rumors. The Ashcroft fortune, about Miss Ruth, about Charlotte herself. Some said Miss Ruth had run off with the sapphire. Others claimed she'd been hiding secrets for years. The gossip magazines speculated endlessly, their headlines splashed with Charlotte's name and the word betrayal. Alone, in the vast, echoing house, Charlotte found herself haunted by memories of Miss Ruth. She remembered the way Miss Ruth would hum softly while folding laundry, the stories she told on stormy nights, the gentle advice she offered when Charlotte's world felt overwhelming. Now, those memories felt like lifelines, reminders of a time when things made sense. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Charlotte wandered into the old nursery. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the flickering light of a single lamp. She sat on the faded window seat, tracing her fingers over the worn fabric, and let herself remember. She saw herself as a child, curled up in Miss Ruth's lap, listening to tales of courage and kindness. She remembered the way Miss Ruth's eyes would light up when she spoke of her own family, of dreams and promises made long ago. But the comfort of those memories was fleeting. The estate was falling apart, literally and figuratively. The roof in the west wing leaked, the gardens were overgrown, and the bills piled up on her father's desk. Charlotte tried to take charge, meeting with lawyers and accountants, but the numbers never added up. Every solution seemed to lead to another problem. The staff, once loyal and discreet, began to talk. Charlotte overheard snippets of conversation about Miss Ruth's new life, about how she'd found work at a community center in the city, about the people who visited her there. Some said she was helping families in need. Others whispered that she was involved in something bigger, something secret. The rumors only deepened Charlotte's sense of loss and confusion. One afternoon, while searching for old financial records, in her father's study, Charlotte stumbled upon a small, ornate box tucked away in the back of a drawer. It was locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the desk. With trembling hands, she opened it and found a bundle of letters, yellowed with age. Most were addressed to her father, but one, written in her mother's elegant script, was addressed to Miss Ruth. Charlotte's breath caught as she unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were unmistakable. Dearest Ruth, I trust you with this because I know you will do what is right, no matter the cost. If anything should happen to me, please. The rest of the letter was missing, torn away as if someone had deliberately removed it. A chill ran down Charlotte's spine. Why would her mother write such a letter to Miss Ruth? What secret had she entrusted to her? And who had taken the rest of the letter? The discovery gnawed at Charlotte, fueling her growing sense of unease. She began to question everything she thought she knew about her family, about Miss Ruth, about the legacy she was supposed to protect. The estate, once a symbol of security and tradition, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets and lies. Desperate for answers, Charlotte reached out to the few people who still spoke to her. She visited the community center where Miss Ruth was rumored to work, but each time she arrived, she was told Miss Ruth was out or unavailable. The staff there were polite but guarded, their eyes wary. It was clear that Miss Ruth had found a new community, one that protected her as fiercely as she had once protected Charlotte. At night, Charlotte lay awake, replaying the events of the past weeks. She thought of the missing sapphire, the letter, the rumors swirling around Miss Ruth. She wondered if she had been too quick to judge, too eager to protect her family's reputation, at the expense of the one person who had always been loyal to her. The estate grew colder, the shadows longer. Charlotte's father grew weaker, his mind clouded by regret and illness. The business teetered on the brink of collapse, and Charlotte felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. She was alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, haunted by the question that would not let her rest. What had Miss Ruth been entrusted with? And what would it cost to uncover the truth? As the rain continued to fall, Charlotte clutched the torn letter to her chest, her resolve hardening. She would find out what her mother had meant, what Miss Ruth knew, and why the truth had been hidden for so long. The answers were out there, buried beneath years of silence and sacrifice. And Charlotte was determined to find them, no matter where they led. Charlotte's car idled at the curb, the city's pulse thrumming around her as she stared at the modest brick building that housed the community center. It was a world away from the marble halls and manicured lawns of the Ashcroft estate, yet something about it felt more alive, more honest. She watched as children spilled out onto the sidewalk, laughing and chasing each other, their parents chatting nearby. Through the glass doors, she glimpsed Miss Ruth, her posture as upright as ever, her face softened by a rare, unguarded smile. Charlotte hesitated, her heart pounding. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that she was here, the words tangled in her throat. She thought of the letter, the missing sapphire, the rumors, and the silence that had grown between them. She thought of her mother's handwriting, the plea for trust, and the secrets that had festered in the shadows of her family's legacy. Summoning her courage, Charlotte stepped inside. The air was warm, filled with the scent of coffee and the low hum of conversation. Miss Ruth looked up, her expression unreadable as their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Ruth nodded, gesturing for Charlotte to follow her into a quiet office at the back of the center. They sat across from each other, the silence thick with everything unspoken. Charlotte's hands trembled as she placed the torn letter on the desk between them. I found this, she said quietly. It's from my mother. To you, the rest is missing. Miss Ruth's eyes lingered on the letter, her fingers tracing the familiar script. She sighed, the weight of years settling on her shoulders. Your mother was a good woman, She tried to do right by everyone, even when it cost her. Charlotte's voice broke. I need to know the truth. About the sapphire, about my family, about you. Miss Ruth looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for the child she once knew. The sapphire was never the real treasure, Charlotte. It was a decoy, meant to distract from what truly mattered. Your mother knew the family's fortune was built on land that didn't belong to them. Land that was taken from my ancestors, piece by piece, through lies and broken promises. Charlotte's breath caught. What are you saying? Miss Ruth opened a drawer and pulled out a battered folder, its edges worn from years of handling. She slid it across the desk. These are the original deeds, letters, and court documents. Proof that the Ashcroft estate and much of the family's wealth was built on land stolen from my great-grandparents. Your mother found them hidden in the attic, along with her own letters. She wanted to make it right, but she died before she could. Charlotte's hands shook as she opened the folder. The documents were yellowed and fragile, but the names and dates were clear. Her family's name, written in bold, legal script, alongside the names of Miss Ruth's ancestors. Deeds signed under duress, letters pleading for justice, court rulings that ignored the truth. My mother, she knew, Charlotte whispered. Miss Ruth nodded. She trusted me to keep these safe. She hoped that one day, someone in your family would have the courage to do what she couldn't. Charlotte's mind reeled. The weight of the estate, the fortune, the legacy, it was all built on a lie. She thought of her father, his pride and his pain. The way he clung to the Ashcroft name as if it could shield him from the world's judgment. She thought of the staff, the community, the people who had suffered while her family prospered. Tears stung her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Miss Ruth's gaze was gentle, but firm. You weren't ready. You needed to see for yourself what this legacy really means. Now you have a choice. Charlotte, you can keep this secret, protect your family's name, and let the past stay buried. Or, you can tell the truth, no matter the cost. Charlotte stared at the documents, her heart pounding. The choice before her was stark: expose her family's crimes and risk losing everything, or cover up the truth and live with the knowledge of what her family had done. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with history and consequence. Miss Ruth reached across the desk, her hand warm and steady on Charlotte's. Your mother believed in you. She believed you could be the one to break the cycle. But only you can decide what kind of legacy you want to leave. Charlotte looked up, meeting Miss Ruth's eyes. For the first time, she saw not just the woman who had raised her, but the strength and sacrifice that had shaped her own life. The truth was a heavy burden, but it was also a chance for redemption. As she gathered the documents, Charlotte knew the path ahead would not be easy. The world she had always known was gone, replaced by a new reality, one where justice and truth demanded a price. But for the first time, she felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that cut through the fear and uncertainty. She stood, the folder clutched to her chest, and nodded. Thank you, Miss Ruth, for everything. Miss Ruth smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Whatever you choose, remember doing what's right is never easy, but it's always worth it. As Charlotte left the community center, the city lights flickering in the dusk, she felt the weight of her family's history pressing down on her. But she also felt something else: a resolve to face the truth, no matter where it led. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was hers to shape. And as she disappeared into the night, the question lingered: would she have the courage to do what her mother could not? The Ashcroft boardroom had always been a place of power. Its mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier's cold light, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes fixed on the present as if daring anyone to challenge the family's legacy. On this day, the room was filled with a tension so thick it seemed to press against the windows, threatening to shatter the illusion of control that had ruled the estate for generations. Charlotte sat at the head of the table, the battered folder of documents resting before her. Her father, pale and gaunt, was flanked by the family lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, and the remaining board members, old friends, distant cousins, and business associates who had profited from the Ashcroft name. At the far end of the table stood Miss Ruth, her posture unyielding, her eyes unwavering as she faced the people who had shaped her life from the shadows. The meeting had been called under the guise of discussing the estate's financial crisis, but everyone in the room knew the real reason. The rumors had reached the press, and reporters waited outside the gates, hungry for scandal. The missing sapphire was no longer the story. It was the whispers of stolen land, of a fortune built on injustice, that threatened to bring the Ashcroft empire to its knees. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice brittle. Charlotte, before we begin, I must remind you that any discussion of these allegations could have serious legal and financial consequences for the family. We must proceed with caution. Charlotte met his gaze, her resolve hardening. We're not here to protect the family's reputation at the expense of the truth. We're here to decide what kind of legacy we want to leave. A murmur rippled through the board. Her father's hand trembled as he reached for his glass of water. Charlotte, think carefully. This is our family's future. Everything we've built was taken from someone else. Charlotte interrupted, her voice steady. She opened the folder and spread the documents across the table. These are the original deeds and letters. They proved that the Ashcroft estate was built on land stolen from Miss Ruth's family. My mother discovered them before she died. She wanted to make it right. The room erupted. Board members shouted over one another, some denying the evidence, others demanding to see the documents for themselves. Mr. Whitaker's face turned ashen as he scanned the papers, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This is outrageous," barked Mr. Hargrove, a distant cousin. "We've owned this land for generations. No one can prove otherwise." Miss Ruth's voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear. "My great-grandparents were forced off their land by your ancestors. They lost everything: home, livelihood, dignity. The courts ignored their pleas, but the truth was never erased. It's all here, in black and white." A reporter's voice echoed from the hallway. The door left ajar in the commotion. "Is it true the Ashcroft fortune was built on stolen land? Will there be reparations?" Cameras flashed, and the board members recoiled, their faces twisted with fear and anger. Charlotte stood, her hands trembling, but her voice strong. "We can't hide from this. The world is watching. We have a choice. Do we continue the cycle of silence and denial, or do we finally do what's right?" Her father's eyes filled with tears, his voice barely a whisper. "Charlotte, please, this will destroy us." Miss Ruth stepped forward, her presence commanding. "You have a chance to do what your ancestors could not, to acknowledge the harm done and begin to make amends. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for justice for my family and for everyone who was wronged." The board fell silent, the weight of history pressing down on them. Mr. Whitaker shuffled the documents, his hands shaking. "If these papers are authentic, we could be facing lawsuits, criminal charges, the loss of the estate. Our investors will pull out. The Ashcroft name will be ruined." Charlotte looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Maybe it's time the Ashcroft name stood for something more than wealth. Maybe it's time it stood for courage and integrity. A heated debate erupted. Some board members argued for a quiet settlement, others for total denial. A few, emboldened by Charlotte's words, spoke of the need for transparency and restitution. The room divided along lines of fear and hope, self-preservation and conscience. Miss Ruth remained silent, her gaze fixed on Charlotte. She had waited a lifetime for this moment, endured decades of silence and injustice. Now, the power to change everything rested in the hands of the girl she had raised. The media outside grew restless, their questions growing louder. Will the Ashcrofts return the land? Will there be reparations? What does Miss Ruth have to say? Charlotte's father slumped in his chair, defeated. "It's your decision, Charlotte. You hold the deciding vote." The board prepared for a formal vote, the tension in the room palpable. Mr. Whitaker read the motion aloud. "Shall the Ashcroft estate acknowledge the historical injustice, return the land and assets to Miss Ruth's family, and establish a fund for reparations?" One by one, the board members cast their votes. Some voted yes, their voices trembling with fear or hope. Others voted no, their faces hard with resentment. The tally was split, the outcome hinging on Charlotte. She looked at her father, at the board, at Miss Ruth. She thought of her mother's letter, of the stories Miss Ruth had told her as a child, of the pain and resilience etched into every line of her face. She thought of the future, the kind of world she wanted to help create. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her, the weight of generations pressed down. But Charlotte felt something shift inside her, a clarity, a sense of purpose that cut through the fear. She spoke, her voice steady and clear. "I vote yes. The Ashcroft estate will acknowledge the truth, return the land and assets, and establish a fund for reparations. It's time to do what's right." A collective gasp filled the room. Some board members slumped in defeat, others nodded in solemn agreement. The reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing, their questions tumbling over one another. Miss Ruth's eyes shone with tears, her composure finally breaking. She stepped forward, taking Charlotte's hands in hers. "Thank you, Charlotte. You've done what so many could not." Charlotte squeezed her hand, her own tears falling freely. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for everything." Miss Ruth smiled, her forgiveness radiating through the room. "It's never too late to do the right thing." The boardroom erupted into chaos as the news spread. Reporters rushed to file their stories, investors called in panic, and the staff gathered in the hallway, whispering in awe. The Ashcroft name, once a symbol of untouchable privilege, was now at the center of a reckoning. Charlotte stood tall, her decision made. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be lawsuits, backlash, and the loss of much of what she had always known. But for the first time, she felt free. The truth was out, and with it came the possibility of healing, of building something new from the ashes of the past. As the boardroom emptied, Miss Ruth lingered, her eyes filled with pride and relief. "You've changed everything, Charlotte, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced." Charlotte nodded, her heart full. "We'll do this together. We'll make it right." Outside, the world waited. The Ashcroft estate, once a fortress of secrets, was now a beacon of hope, a place where justice, at long last, had a chance to take root. But as the dust settled and the first steps toward restitution began, Charlotte knew this was only the beginning. The true test would be in the days to come. as the world watched to see if the promise of justice would be kept. And as the boardroom doors closed behind her, Charlotte felt the weight of history lift, replaced by the lightness of possibility. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it belonged to everyone. The news broke before the ink on the board's decision was dry. By the time Charlotte stepped out of the boardroom, the world was already watching. Reporters crowded the gates, their voices rising in a cacophony of questions and camera flashes. Headlines blared across screens and social media feeds. Ashcroft heiress exposes family's dark past. Stolen land returned after century-long injustice. Miss Ruth's family reclaims their legacy. The Ashcroft estate, once a symbol of untouchable privilege, was now the epicenter of a reckoning. Inside, the boardroom was a storm of emotion. Some board members sat in stunned silence. Others argued in hushed, frantic tones about legal fallout and public relations. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. She had just signed the documents that would transfer the estate and its remaining assets to Miss Ruth's family, and with each stroke of the pen, she felt the weight of generations lift from her shoulders. Miss Ruth stood beside her, dignified and resolute. The years of quiet endurance, of carrying secrets and pain, seemed to fall away as she watched Charlotte fulfill the promise her mother had made so long ago. The room, once filled with the voices of those who had profited from silence, now echoed with the sound of justice being delivered. Mr. Whitaker, the family lawyer, cleared his throat, his voice subdued. The transfer is official. The estate, the land, and the trust fund for reparations are now in the name of the original owners, Miss Ruth's family. He looked at Charlotte, a flicker of respect in his eyes. You understand this will set a precedent. Other families, other estates, this could change everything. Charlotte nodded, her resolve unwavering. The truth matters. Justice matters. If we can start something bigger, then maybe all of this pain will mean something. The board members filed out, some with heads bowed in shame, others with faces set in anger or disbelief. Charlotte's father lingered, his eyes hollow. He reached for her hand, his grip weak. I never thought it would come to this, he whispered. But maybe it's time. Charlotte squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. It's not the end, Father, it's a new beginning. For all of us. As the last of the board members left, Miss Ruth and Charlotte remained in the room. The silence between them now filled with possibility rather than regret. Miss Ruth turned to Charlotte, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I never thought I'd see this day, Miss Ruth said softly. For so long, I carried the weight of what was lost. I thought justice was just a word people used to make themselves feel better. But you proved me wrong. Charlotte's own eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for everything my family did, and for what I did to you. I was afraid of losing everything, of facing the truth. But you never gave up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. Miss Ruth reached out, taking Charlotte's hands in hers. You were a child, Charlotte. You grew up in a world built on lies, just like I did. But you chose to break the cycle. That takes courage. And forgiveness. They stood together, the past and future meeting, in a moment of understanding. The years of pain and betrayal, of love and loyalty, were not erased, but transformed. In that moment, they were not Heiress and Nanny, not oppressor and oppressed, but two women bound by truth and hope. The door opened, and a reporter stepped in, her notepad ready. Miss Ashcroft, Miss Ruth, can you comment on what this means for the community, for other families with similar histories? Charlotte glanced at Miss Ruth, who nodded. We hope this is just the beginning, Charlotte said, her voice clear and strong. There are so many stories like ours, families who lost everything, who were silenced and forgotten. It's time for those stories to be heard, for justice to be done, no matter how long it takes. Miss Ruth added, this isn't just about land or money. It's about dignity, about healing. We can't change the past, but we can choose what we do with the truth. We can build something better. The reporter scribbled furiously, her eyes alight with the promise of a new story. Are you prepared for the backlash? For the legal battles that might follow? Charlotte nodded. We're prepared. We know it won't be easy, but we're not afraid. The truth is on our side. As the reporter left, the room filled with a sense of quiet triumph. Outside, the community began to gather at the gate, some in support, others in protest, but all drawn by the magnitude of what had happened. The estate staff, many of whom had worked under Miss Ruth's quiet leadership, came forward to offer their congratulations, their faces alight with hope. The media coverage was relentless. News anchors debated the implications, legal experts weighed in on the precedent, and activists called for further investigations into other families and estates with similar histories. The Ashcroft case became a rallying cry, a symbol of what was possible when truth and courage prevailed. Charlotte and Miss Ruth stood together on the steps of the estate. Facing the crowd, Charlotte spoke first, her voice carrying across the lawn. This land was never truly ours. It belonged to Miss Ruth's family, and today, we return it to its rightful owners. We do this not out of charity, but out of justice. We hope others will follow. Miss Ruth stepped forward, her presence commanding. We accept this, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been denied justice. Let this be a beginning, not an end. Let us work together to heal, to build, to remember. The crowd erupted in applause, some weeping openly, others cheering. The moment was electric, charged with the possibility of real change. Later, as the sun set over the estate, Charlotte and Miss Ruth walked the grounds together. The gardens, once overgrown and neglected, seemed to bloom anew in the golden light. They spoke of the future of transforming the estate into a community center, a place of learning and healing, open to all. They spoke of scholarships, of programs for youth, of ways to honor the past while building a better tomorrow. Charlotte paused by the old oak tree, her childhood refuge. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked quietly. Miss Ruth smiled, her eyes wise and kind. "I think people can choose, and every choice matters. You chose justice, Charlotte. That's how change begins." They stood in silence, the weight of history finally giving way to hope. The estate, once a fortress of secrets, was now a beacon, a place where justice had been delivered, and where the future was being rewritten. That as night fell, the media continued to buzz with speculation. Which family will be next? One anchor asked, how many more secrets are waiting to be uncovered? The Ashcroft story had opened a door that could not be closed, and across the country, others began to step forward, inspired by what had happened. But for Charlotte and Miss Ruth, the noise faded into the background. They had done what was right, and in doing so, had found not just justice, but each other. Their story was no longer one of loss and betrayal, but of courage, forgiveness, and the power of truth. In the quiet of the evening, as the estate settled into its new life, Charlotte turned to Miss Ruth. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Miss Ruth squeezed her hand, her voice gentle. "Thank you, Charlotte, for believing in justice, for believing in me." And as the stars emerged above the estate, the promise of a new beginning shone brighter than ever. The world was watching, and the story was far from over. But for the first time, it was a story of hope. The transformation of the Ashcroft estate was nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been velvet ropes and locked doors, now there was laughter, music, and the hum of possibility. The grand halls, stripped of their exclusivity, became classrooms and meeting spaces. The ballroom, once reserved for the city's elite, now hosted after-school programs, job fairs, and community dinners. The gardens, lovingly restored, bloomed with color and life, tended by volunteers from every corner of the city. Charlotte moved through these new spaces with a sense of purpose she had never known. She worked side by side with Miss Ruth, their partnership a living testament to the power of reconciliation. Together, they launched the Ashcroft Scholarship Fund, dedicated to supporting marginalized youth children who, like Miss Ruth's ancestors, had been denied opportunity for generations. The fund grew quickly, fueled by donations from those inspired by the Ashcroft story and by Charlotte's own commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. The community center became a beacon. Families who had once felt unwelcome on the estate's grounds now found a place to gather, learn, and dream. Charlotte watched as children played in the gardens, their laughter echoing through the halls. She saw young people discover their talents in art and music classes, and parents find support in job training workshops. The estate, once a symbol of exclusion, was now a sanctuary of hope. Miss Ruth thrived in her new role as director of the center. Her wisdom and warmth drew people in, and her story inspired others to share their own. She led workshops on local history, teaching the truth about the land and the people who had shaped it. She mentored young leaders, encouraging them to speak up, to organize, to demand justice. Her presence was a daily reminder that change was possible, that healing could begin with a single act of courage. Charlotte found herself changed as well. The burden of her family's legacy no longer weighed her down. Instead, it propelled her forward. She spoke at rallies and town halls, urging other families to examine their own histories, to seek out the truth, and to make amends. She met with lawmakers and activists, advocating for policies that would make reparations and restorative justice a reality for more people. Her voice, once timid and uncertain, now rang with conviction. The Ashcroft story spread far beyond the city. News outlets ran follow-up stories on the estate's transformation, and social media buzzed with updates on the scholarship recipients and community programs. Other families, inspired by Charlotte's example, began to come forward with their own stories of hidden injustices and long-buried secrets. Some faced backlash, but many found support and solidarity in the growing movement for reparations and justice. One afternoon, as Charlotte and Miss Ruth prepared for a community event, a group of scholarship recipients gathered in the old library. They spoke of their dreams, becoming doctors, teachers, artists, and leaders. Charlotte listened, her heart swelling with pride. She saw in them the future she and Miss Ruth had fought for, a future where every child had a chance, where every story mattered. The estate's transformation was not without challenges. There were protests from those who resented the changes, who clung to the old ways and the old power. There were legal battles over the transfer of assets, and threats from distant relatives who felt cheated. But Charlotte and Miss Ruth stood firm, supported by a community that had found its voice. Each victory, no matter how small, was a step toward a more just and inclusive world. The ripple effects of their actions were felt far and wide. Local officials began to review land records and property deeds, uncovering other cases of stolen land and unjust enrichment. Lawmakers introduced bills to support reparations and community investment. Universities and museums reached out to Miss Ruth, seeking her guidance on how to tell the true story of the region's history. The Ashcroft estate became a model for what was possible when truth and justice were placed above pride and profit. One evening, as the sun set over the gardens, Charlotte and Miss Ruth sat together on the steps of the main house. They watched as families gathered for a community dinner, the air filled with the scent of barbecue and the sound of music. Children chased fireflies across the lawn, their laughter a melody of hope. Charlotte turned to Miss Ruth, her voice soft. "Did you ever imagine it would be like this?" Miss Ruth smiled, her eyes shining. "I dreamed of it, but I never thought I'd see it. You made it possible, Charlotte. You chose to listen, to act, to believe that things could be different." Charlotte shook her head. "We did it together. And now, so many others are following. It's bigger than us." Miss Ruth nodded, her gaze distant for a moment. "That's how change happens. One story at a time, one act of courage at a time. The past doesn't have to define us. We can choose what comes next." As the evening deepened, a hush fell over the crowd. A car pulled up to the estate's entrance, and a figure stepped out. Tan older woman, her posture regal, her eyes sharp with purpose. She moved through the crowd with quiet authority, pausing at the steps where Charlotte and Miss Ruth sat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "I'm looking for Miss Ruth. I believe we have something in common, a story that's been waiting to be told." Miss Ruth rose, her expression curious and cautious. "And what story is that?" The woman smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "My family lost everything to the Ashcrofts, but our story was buried even deeper. I have documents, letters, proof. I've been waiting for the right moment, the right people, to come forward." Charlotte and Miss Ruth exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them. The work was not finished. There were more stories to uncover, more truths to face, more justice to deliver. Miss Ruth extended her hand. "You're welcome here. Let's talk. Let's see what we can do together." As the three women disappeared into the house, the community center buzzed with anticipation. The movement that had begun with a single act of courage was growing, fueled by the power of truth and the promise of justice. The Ashcroft estate, once a fortress of secrets, was now a home for healing, a place where the past was honored and the future was being rewritten. And as the night settled over the estate, Charlotte felt a sense of peace she had never known. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, at the heart of a new beginning, surrounded by hope and ready for whatever stories might come next. I used to believe that justice was something that happened in courtrooms or history books, far removed from the world I knew. I thought privilege was invisible, a birthright I never questioned, and that redemption was for those who had done something unforgivable. But I was wrong. Justice is not a distant ideal, it's a choice we make every day. In the ways we treat each other, in the truths we're willing to face, and in the courage it takes to do what's right, even when it costs us everything. When I look back on the journey that brought me here, I see a path paved with mistakes, with fear, and with silence. I see the ways I clung to comfort, to reputation, to the illusion that the past could be buried. But I also see the moments of awakening, the first time I truly listened to Miss Ruth, the first time I questioned the stories I'd been told, the first time I understood that my family's legacy was built on someone else's loss. Privilege, I've learned, is not just about what we have, but about what we're willing to give up for the sake of justice. It's about using our voices, our resources, and our influence to lift others up, to repair what's been broken, and to create space for stories that have been silenced for too long. It's about recognizing that we are all connected, that our futures are bound together, and that true redemption comes not from erasing the past, but from facing it with honesty and humility. Redemption is possible. I've seen it in the transformation of the Ashcroft estate, in the laughter of children who now play where doors were once closed to them, in the hope that fills the halls where secrets once festered. I've seen it in Miss Ruth's forgiveness, in her willingness to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. I've seen it in myself, in the way I've learned to let go of fear and embrace the responsibility that comes with knowing the truth. But this story is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who has ever been denied justice, to everyone who has ever wondered if change is possible. It belongs to you too. We all have a role to play in building a more just and compassionate world. We all have stories to tell, truths to uncover, and choices to make. So I invite you, I urge you to look at your own life, your own community, your own history. Ask the hard questions. Listen to the voices that have been ignored. Stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. Share your story, and listen to the stories of others. Justice begins with a single act of courage, and it grows with every person who chooses to join the movement. As Miss Ruth once told me, true wealth is measured by the lives we touch, Those words have become my guide, my hope, and my promise. I hope they become yours, too. The work is not finished. There are more stories to uncover, more wounds to heal, more justice to deliver. But together, we can build a future where every life is valued, every voice is heard, and every story matters. Share your story. Join the movement. Let's touch lives together.